Good evening. My name is James Stowe. I am President and CEO of the Center for Practical Bioethics. Thank you. I am proud and honored to welcome you tonight to this historic venue, the Gem Theater. It's the crown jewel of the 18th and Vine Jazz District of Kansas City. And what a perfect location for the topic of tonight's 31st Rosemary Flanigan Lecture, Jazz, Bioethics, and the Moral Practice of Medicine. This may, for many of you, be the first time at a Center for Practical Bioethics event, and you may be wondering what we're all about. It's an unusual name, the Center for Practical Bioethics, so we'll tell you a little bit about ourselves. The center was founded 41 years ago when a lawyer, physician, and philosopher realized there had to be better ways to resolve ethical issues that were arising from rapidly emerging technology. Does this sound familiar? The center raises and responds to ethical issues in health and healthcare. We emphasize the word practical in our name because we apply bioethics to real-life issues. And we do that by providing ethics services in the spaces and places where difficult decisions have to be made, often quickly, often when there's no right or wrong answer, and almost always where reasonable people will disagree. The center is the only freestanding organization in the country singularly dedicated to bioethics in action, bringing bioethics directly to patients, providers, and the community. Even as our world becomes more polarized, more uncertain, and less stable, the center does not shrink from thorny issues. End of life, reproductive health, organ transplantation, medical aid in dying, allocation of scarce resources. The list goes on. Doctors, nurses, patients, and families call the center when they need a clinical ethicist to help resolve an ethical dilemma. Hospital and hospices call the center when an ethicist perspective can complement the oversight of clinicians, risk managers, and technicians. Healthcare IT leaders call us to help establish ethical standards to ensure AI safety and accountability. And policymakers call for help evaluating legislation for potential intended and unintended consequences. There is great danger in this moment to become complicit in harm, embittered, or apathetic. The fact that so many of you are gathered in this room should give us hope. And what is jazz about if not hope, right? Again, welcome. Before I turn this over to our board chair, Dr. Steven Solansky, I want to encourage you to take the opportunity after Dr. Smith speaks to meet the center's recently appointed John B. Francis co-chairs in bioethics, Kayhan Parsi and Nanette Elster. They were recruited after an extensive national search that included international candidates. We feel doubly blessed. Kayhan and Nanette are a married couple and continuous professors at the Niswonger Institute for Bioethics at Loyola University Chicago, Stritch School of Medicine. Notably, Kayhan was last year's immediate past president of the American Society for Bioethics and Humanities, and our speaker this evening is the current president. And now, join me in welcoming Dr. Solansky to introduce our Vision to Action Award.
Thank you, James, and thanks to all of you for being here tonight. The Vision to Action Award recognizes an individual who, through their leadership, vision, and commitment, demonstrates the highest ethical standards of conduct, driven by shared values and virtues to which we all aspire. Now, another way to define it is by discussing the career of Dr. Ed Kramer. Ed has a 5-page, single-spaced, very small font CV, which lists all his positions of work, his professional organizations, most of those with leadership roles, articles and presentations that he's done, as well as honors and awards that he has received. They are all too numerous to list here tonight. So I want to just highlight 3 areas of work that he has done that really speak to the Vision to Action Award. Now, while a family physician in Lee Summit, Ed chaired the Lee Summit Medical Center Ethics Committee from 2003 to 2011. When he joined the faculty at University of Missouri Kansas City School of Medicine and University Health, he became chair of the University Health Lakewood Ethics Committee and served in that role from 2012 to 2023. That is 21 years of chairing a hospital ethics committee, which means that if the ethics committee meets about every month, that he had to prepare for approximately 252 meetings, plus policy work, not to mention ethics case consultations. Ed also serves on the University Health Hospital Hill Ethics Committee and has participated in the Center's Ethics Committee Consortium. He has taught or arranged regular ethics didactics for the UMKC family medicine residents, as well as giving an annual Intro to Bioethics lecture for the UMKC School of Medicine students. In his current role as program director of the UMKC School of Medicine Physician Assistant Program, he is course director for medical ethics and the law. This is a vision to action in bioethics. Now, when it comes to community health, Ed says that he is an accidental activist. And he's actually written an article and done presentations on that topic. And he has developed an accidental activist algorithm. First, pick your passion. Second, show up. Third, hang around. And fourth, do what needs to be done. In 2005, Ed reluctantly, very reluctantly, I might say, joined with me to co-chair Clean Air Lee's Summit to address health concerns about secondhand smoke. And when the Lee Summit City Council failed to pass our group's proposed ordinance, we spearheaded a citizens petition, the Clean Indoor Air Act of 2006, which passed with 71% of the vote, making Lee Summit one of the first 3 Kansas City communities requiring all public places to be smoke-free. As co-chair of the Lee Summit Health Education Advisory Board from 2007 to 2023, Ed continued to work with the City Council, and I would say sometimes that was very hard work with the Lee Summit City Council, to develop ordinances on public health issues, including indoor vaping, tobacco 21, and in response to marijuana legalization. He also helped to lead multiple hands-only CPR training courses for Lee Summit citizens, as well as writing or editing public education articles on a wide variety of health topics. This is a vision to action in community health. In 2010, Ed joined with a group of citizens who were concerned about safe and accessible walking and biking in Lee Summit. He became the inaugural chair of the Lee Summit Livable Streets Advisory Board in 2011 and has been on the board ever since, and is chairing it again now as a member of the Lee Summit Wellness Commission. And Mary, I hope this is not the first time you've heard that. He led the advisory board's work alongside the Lee Summit city traffic engineer to develop livable streets policies and actual road and sidewalk improvements leading to much safer streets. Now, Ed has a full PowerPoint presentation about this. I don't think he's going to show that tonight, but he also has before and after pictures on his phone. So if you're interested in seeing those after this evening's event, I'm sure he would be sure to share those with you. Lee Summit was awarded 2 national designations for this work. I think it is safe to say that Ed is considered to be Mr. Livable Streets in Lee Summit. Maybe we should say Dr. Livable Streets in Lee Summit. This is another vision to action in community health. Now, Ed says he plans to retire next summer, but I'm guessing he'll continue to pick his passions, show up, hang around, and do what needs to be done. It is an honor and a pleasure to present this 2025 Vision to Action Award to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Ed Kramer. Mary's taking the picture.
Thank you, everyone, and good evening. What an awesome program this evening, and just the whole venue and the whole jazz and medical ethics, and it's just great. And thank you, my dear friend, Dr. Solansky, for your generous introduction. I'm not sure I actually prepared for all of those meetings, as you implied, but I did show up, for sure. For sure, Dr. Solansky is guilty of luring me into the lucrative world of community service. 20 years ago, Steve convinced me that there was important work to be done, even if I felt too busy or, frankly, too anxious about getting involved. Since that time, we've worked closely together on many public health endeavors. If not right by my side, he's usually way ahead of me. And he mentioned my co-chairing the Health Education Advisory Board for some 15 years. Guess who was the other co-chair? Dr. Solansky. As you all know, one or two people can only accomplish so much. I find that it helps to surround myself with people who are smarter and more talented than me. Frankly, I can't believe how easy it is to do that. And getting easier. I'd like to acknowledge all those dedicated people with whom I've had the pleasure of working on community health initiatives in Lee Summit and Jackson County and on the ethics committee at University Health. In addition to Dr. Solansky, I've enjoyed the friendship and mentorship of my other ethics heroes, George Flanigan, Bill Colby, Rick Butin, and Brian Carter, who are here tonight. All are skilled and compassionate medical ethicists. And I'm invigorated by the interest in medical ethics by my students at UMKC School of Medicine and PA program. I'd like to thank our dean, Dr. Alex Norbash, who is here tonight, and other colleagues for being here, always so supportive. Thank you so much. Throughout my ethics journey, the Center for Practical Bioethics has been a tremendous resource, including support and inspiration dating all the way back to Myra Christopher, Sister Rosemary Flanigan, Robert Potter, John Carney, Terry Roselle, who I saw earlier, and more recently, Ryan Ferdehert. You may not know this, but these are the people who actually get paid for thinking ethical thoughts. Really, that's their day job, and they do it so well. I'm grateful to my wife, Mary, and our children, Carl, Kelsey, and Tessa, for allowing me time away from family to do this community work through the years. And my big brother, John, who drove down from Omaha today, and our sister, Maureen, who will be joining us online at some point from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge anyone who has been thoughtful and caring enough to pose the question, should we ask the ethics committee about this? And the patients, families, and healthcare professionals who have benefited from the committee's response. I am deeply honored to receive this Vision to Action Award. Thank you so much.
Good evening, and thank you everyone for being here tonight. And congratulations again to Ed. He and I both serve on the University Health Ethics Committee. He's an amazing champion of ethics, a deserving recipient, and a genuinely good person. I enjoy every opportunity that I can to work with Ed and be involved. I volunteer whenever he asks, and I'm always happy to jump. It is great to be here tonight and to meet so many new people. For those who don't know, I am Ryan Ferdehert, the Sister Rosemary Flanigan Chair of Bioethics and the Vice President of Ethics Services at the Center for Practical Bioethics. I also teach at Kansas City University. This is my first year serving as the Flanigan Chair, and thus my first time organizing this lecture series, both of which are named after Sister Rosemary Flanigan, who recently celebrated her 99th birthday. Her work in Kansas City and medical ethics is known and respected. She was a champion of ethics, ethics education, and serving with compassion for all those who impacted by this work. Her work was carried forward by Dr. Terry Roselle, my predecessor and friend. It is my privilege to learn and study with Terry for several years and my honor to carry on his work with the center. And what powerful work it is. As James mentioned, the center serves a relatively unique role in being an independent bioethics center that partners with hospitals and organizations to provide ethics consultation services and education. These can come in many forms, but the most impactful are clinical ethics situations. It is an incredible organization that I am honored to be a part of. A majority of my work that I am involved with includes partnering and supporting hospitals, hospices, and other health organizations that face challenging ethical scenarios. These situations are complicated and as varied as you can imagine. Some recent that I've been involved in include a 90-year-old patient and her health was declining and she was ready for hospice. Unfortunately, her children did not agree with her, and they were pushing for her to continue aggressive measures, including a feeding tube. I had a great conversation with her, and she insisted on focusing only on comfort measures. I told her that I was going to carry on that conversation and share it with her son, and she pulled me close, and she was very faint of speaking, and she said, "Oh, he's going to yell at you." And I said, "Don't, it's okay, I have tough skin, and I'm willing to take the blow for you." Another situation I was involved with recently was an elderly man who had severe dementia. He was dying and had poor nutrition and had very bad wounds, but his family were demanding that we do surgery and place a feeding tube. And another involved a younger patient who had a large mass in his neck, and he did not have capacity or had anyone to consent for him. We needed to do a biopsy to determine how aggressive the mass was, if it was cancer or not, but without anyone to sign the consent, surgery was concerned. The hospital was unable to locate any friends or family for the biopsy, so they turned to the ethics committee for guidance. Every day we face challenging situations like these. Family members unable to agree on a plan of care for a loved one, a patient without capacity and no one to speak on their behalf, or someone intubated, but later we discover that they had a DNR. The work is never boring. And these are the common situations. We are also involved in new and coming challenges. These include advancements in medicine, changes to methods and locations for the delivery of care, and new, potentially disruptive technologies such as AI. I firmly hold that technology and medical ethics are deeply connected. Our adage in the field is just because we can, does that mean we should? The future certainly holds new things that we are going to be able to do, but it is also important to consider what we should do. This is one of the major aims of the Center for Practical Bioethics. We want to be able to support everyone who is impacted by these situations and ensure that they have access to high-quality ethics support to address them. That could be by serving as a clinical ethicist for an organization, by being available to provide additional support to a rural hospital system, or providing education and training to a team so that they are able to tackle these situations with quality and compassion. That is the motivating drive behind this work. I believe in this field and this work and want to make it as available as possible to as many as possible. Most hospitals do not have the financial means to bring on a full-time ethicist, so we aim to fill that gap by providing quality ethics consultation support as well as training the next generation of ethicists. It is only through support from our communities, leaders, and people like yourselves here tonight that we are able to achieve this goal. Your gift tonight will go forward to providing real-time consultation support for patients and providers, developing more ethicists, as well as growing these competencies for healthcare providers. We want to make it easy so that you can see behind me, you can scan the QR code directly on our donation page, or you may raise your hand so a member of our team can bring you an envelope if you would rather donate by check or cash. We would not be able to do this work without you, and we appreciate what you are able to contribute. Thank you for your support. Times are changing, and new ethical challenges are coming. The future will be complicated with new medical procedures and technologies, but as we prepare for the future, we look to the past for guidance. There are many lessons in our culture, history, and people that will help us shape that future together. Which brings me to our excellent speaker for tonight, Dr. Patrick Smith, and his talk this evening, Reflections on an Imperfect Art, Jazz, Medical Ethics, and the Moral Practice of Medicine. I am very excited for this talk. As I mentioned, this is my first time hosting this lecture series, so I was given the opportunity to pick the speaker, and this is my opportunity to hear this talk. This is a very selfish means of participation. Dr. Smith is an associate research professor of theological ethics and bioethics and a senior fellow at the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University. Along with his work at the Divinity School, Dr. Smith is a director of the Bioethics program for the Trent Center of Bioethics, Humanities, and the History of Medicine, and an associate professor of population health sciences in the Department of Health Sciences at Duke Medical School. He has recently been elected as recently elected as the president of the American Society of Bioethics, and his research and writing are in the areas of moral philosophy, bioethics, theological ethics, end-of-life care, and religious social ethics. Thank you everyone, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Patrick Smith.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan, for that introduction here. Let's see if I can lift that up just a little bit, being 6'5", to make sure you all can hear me on this evening. And it's a tremendous pleasure to be here. I do want to add my voice of congratulations to Dr. Kramer for your award and the recognition of all the good work that you have done. And so it's quite impressive and really grateful to be in your presence on this evening. So congrats. And as your brother said, he didn't want you to get the big head, but I talked him into letting you have it tonight, right? It's like, he's a humble guy, but let him do it tonight. So, but no, congratulations once again. Well, good evening. All right. Now, so as, we talk about this whole thing about jazz, I'll say something about call and response a little bit later. So, and you can help me feel more comfortable and at home, right, by bringing some energy. So I'll say good evening. You say good evening. Oh, now that makes me feel very, very good. Thank you so much for that. Now, I must admit, I am so excited about being here for these Flanigan lectures and the Center for Practical Bioethics. I feel like I have cut my teeth on the center's work for 2 decades now. So when I first started doing work in bioethics, the resources that the Center for Practical Bioethics produced was just like a lifeline for me in so many ways. And so to have this being full circle, I'm truly honored. Now, I must admit that when Ryan reached out and submitted the invitation for the Flanigan lectures, I did feel a little bit like the mule whose owner entered him into the Kentucky Derby, or tried to. After the organizers of the event rejected him, of course, they were so curious as to why this owner of this mule would do such a crazy and ridiculous thing. And so they asked this guy, well, why did you do that? You had to have known he couldn't have won, or that he wouldn't be entered into this race. And the old farmer said, well, I figured as much, but I thought the mere association may do him some good, right? And so to be associated with past lecturers in this space is a significant honor for me and to me, and I think it will do me some good. Also, just want to acknowledge the wonderful work that the center is doing with medical education. Had a wonderful time with students on this afternoon where I shared with them at the end that as bleak as things may seem around us and so many things going on that could disorient us and maybe have us being discombobulated in some ways, just to see the passion of the students, the focus, the intentionality, the experience, the energy that they're bringing to this space, it really encouraged me, and it just gave me hope. I'm not much of an optimist, but I am hopeful in many ways, especially after spending the time with the students on this afternoon. So thanks so much for those who may be here, but for just that interaction as well. And so Ryan, appreciate that wonderful introduction. Grateful to Dr. James Stowe, the leader of the Center for Practical Bioethics here, CEO and president. Really grateful for the ride and the conversation. I lost track of James. Right in front of me, right, sitting right next to me. There you go. And so really, really appreciate this, the hospitality that has been shown as well. And to Miss Abby Gass-Waterson, Miss Cassie Schaefer-Johnson, and Miss Odessa Sawyer. Thank you for your organization of this event and also the logistical details of my visit here. And I had to apologize profusely, and I thought I would have to bring gifts because I think them trying to catch me a few times was like trying to catch the wind. And so I was so grateful to see that they still received me very well and didn't give me those penetrating eyes of arrows kind of shooting through me. But thank you all so very much for all the work that you've done on behalf of my visit here. And as you can see, I'm probably going to enjoy myself this evening. I hope you enjoy yourself because I'm going to enjoy myself. And I am certainly just happy and thrilled to be here. Now, I want to begin by saying that I am not a musician, although I did play at a saxophone during my teenage years, nor am I a jazz historian or a teacher of musical theory. I am just someone who is trained in moral philosophy and religious social ethics, working in bioethics, who loves music, in this case, in particular jazz, and who loves hanging around artists as they engage in their craft. And I would also just say that I am one who has found in jazz, understood as more than music, resources that can shape the ethical life. Now, I am not foolish enough to believe that everyone is here because they like jazz music, perhaps, even though we are in Kansas City. I suspect a few of you may be here because you're wondering what kind of Jedi mind trick I may be trying to pull off by bringing these ideas in conversation together. But I don't think that one has to like jazz music to appreciate what some of the motifs that we find in jazz, again, understood as more than music, can contribute to our thinking about the moral practice of medicine, our broader work in bioethics, and also for movements towards health justice. Given that there are so many, I would just assume experienced musicians and artists in this room and online who know so much more about these motifs that I hope to highlight in my reflections this evening. I want to make sure that we save a little time for us to be able to riff off of one another regarding some of these ideas so that it can be generative for shaping the work it is that we do. Now, those of us who may have some awareness of jazz performance may see the vibrant and seemingly joyful appearance of artists and the relaxed settings people often inhabit during these performances as kind of conveying a deep sense of joy and freedom. And perhaps this is rightfully so. Maybe there are images conjured up of laid back, relaxed, chilled out, and cool cats jamming on instruments and creating experience of catharsis for all those participating when, as some of them say, they find the groove or are in the pocket. Some of us may have the added stereotype of some musician who is able to have an entire conversation with us while holding a lit cigarette between his lips without ever taking it out, right? I don't know. And that is a sight to behold for those of you who've ever seen such a thing. The outward appearances of joy and deep ecstatic experiences that some may have when engaging this music could possibly, just possibly, obscure some important features about jazz, understood as more than music. To appreciate this, I think it is important to remember that jazz, as a distinctively African-American generated musical art form, has worldwide impact that came together around the turn of the 20th century. I want to suggest that awareness of the socio-political and historical context of where jazz came from is important to note to understand how jazz can perhaps inform the ethical life. Its birthplace is said to be in New Orleans. Early accounts describe how the Spanish who let their Catholicized slaves have Sundays off would gather in Congo Square. Now, Congo Square is the southern part of Armstrong Park in New Orleans and played a central role in the development of jazz. And of course, those of you who may be historians of this genre recognize that there are multiple kinds of origin stories of how this is told, and many would suggest that there was a kind of simultaneous happenings in different places, and yet many would often point to the significance of New Orleans and in particular Congo Square. This southern part of Armstrong Park in New Orleans that was pivotal here. Here, there were these enslaved people in the 19th century who would play African music characterized by accented offbeat rhythms. That would become a fundamental ingredient or feature to the development of this music that would be called jazz. Now, the music contained elements of slave songs, the spirituals, bent blue notes, and African drum rhythms, along with many other features. Award-winning music historian Ted Gioia brings all of these features together when he writes these words to give us a kind of picture of what was going on here. He says that no urban area on the planet offered a more diverse cultural mix during the years leading up to the emergence of jazz than New Orleans. New Orleans was the melting pot within the larger melting pot of American life. And when vibrant cultural traditions are forced into such close interaction and exposed to so many disparate influences, exciting new hybrids invariably emerge from the mix. In this instance, the result was jazz, a distinctive performance style created by Black Americans who drew on and added to the extraordinary musical ecosystem of the turn of the century New Orleans. When we listen to the ways New Millennium Jazz mixes effortlessly with Latin and Caribbean currents or with the formal structures of Western classical music, we are experiencing a continuation of the cultural dialogue that presided over the idiom's birth. Now, around the time when jazz emerged on the scene, New Orleans was also one of the unhealthiest cities in the United States. The yellow fever epidemic raged through the city in 1878. Black infant mortality in the city at the time was 45%, and the typical lifespan of an African American was only 36 years. All cities had to deal with public health risk, but New Orleans was especially dangerous, according to some historians, because of its particular mix of well-traveled residents, climate, population density, and poor local sanitation. Now, one cannot forget the deep racial discrimination, social injustice, and economic exploitation that was being experienced by African American people at this time. And of course, there were many from other racial and ethnic backgrounds experiencing various forms of discrimination and exploitation and poverty in that context. Now, all of this, I want to suggest, is important for us to note and to keep in mind, and it is important to remind ourselves for the purposes of this evening, on this occasion, the social marginalization of so many people and how that impacted negatively often their health. And so, jazz vocalist Ruth Naomi Floyd can say without hyperbole that jazz is the art form that was born of oppression and pain. And this, I would suggest, is crucial for us to keep in mind when thinking about jazz as more than music and reflecting on it for our ethical life. Like many of you, I think that there is something very powerful about the musical arts and all of the arts. And I think there is something interesting about jazz often being identified, as some would say, as an imperfect art. Following those working in aesthetic philosophy, if I can be just a bit nerdy here, we can think about jazz being an imperfect art in contrast with other forms of art. As will be stated in just a few minutes here, the very nature of jazz demands a kind of spontaneity within parameters. And so often improvised art is considered to be a kind of, some would suggest, second-rate art, as art which is necessarily less worthy of our attention than that which is a result of careful planning all the way through from beginning to end. And so many of the virtues that those working in aesthetics sometimes search for in other forms of art, things such as premeditated design, balance between form and content, and overall symmetry, may often be absent in jazz. Or maybe it is not represented in the same degree, in the same ways at least. So can this imperfect art of jazz stand alongside other forms of art such as poetry, painting, and the literary arts, etc., in the realm of aesthetic beauty? So it probably doesn't surprise you that my response would be that I actually think so. I follow the judgment here of a music historian when he writes these words. Clearly, any set of aesthetic standards which seek perfection or near perfection in the work of art will find little to praise in jazz. Yet this approach, however prevalent, is not the only valid way of evaluating works of art. A contrasting, if not complementary, attitude looks not at the art in isolation, but in relation to the artist who created it. It asks whether that work is expressive of the artist, whether it reflects their own unique and incommensurable perspective of their art, whether it makes a statement without which the world would be in some small way a lesser place. This, I believe, this historian notes, is precisely the attitude towards art that delights in this thing called jazz. Now, I do acknowledge that this orientation is at odds with certain Enlightenment ways of thinking about notions of beauty and art. Nevertheless, I would suggest that maybe, just maybe, we can still draw some reflections from this imperfect art that is generated by imperfect people navigating an imperfect world for the imperfect work of medicine and bioethics. Can these reflections help us think differently about the rhythm of our work? And so I take it, this idea of rhythm that is so familiar to us, to be, as it is stated in the American Jazz Museum across the street, where rhythm is that regular pattern of recurring or repeating beats. It is a basic part of all music. And in jazz, rhythm creates mood, pace, and texture. In other words, it sets the stage for us, so to speak. So my question is, what beats can we hit to create rhythms in the moral practice of medicine and the work of bioethics that are marked by attention to equity in health promotion and in healthcare delivery? Though there are many ways I think that this can be done, I want to briefly highlight three major themes for us to reflect upon together here. The first motif I want to highlight for us is this notion of syncopation. Syncopation is being aware of the main beats and the offbeats. You accent that which was always there, but has not always been heard. The idea that I want to raise here regarding syncopation is that the emphasis on finding the beat on the offbeat or accenting rhythms that run within or even counter to the dominant momentum to uncover or reveal a rhythm that was otherwise hidden. Now, of course, other forms of music do use syncopation, as you are all aware. But as some others have said, jazz is syncopation gone mad, right? The idea here is closely related to the idea of swing, that jazz swings. That is, it picks up momentum, it presses forward and searches for what is to come. Swing is that basic unit of rhythm. And so learning the art or appreciating the art of syncopation, again, makes us more aware of the moment. Syncopation helps us to notice the unnoticed. When we create space in our institutions and in our encounters, we need to be sure that we're taking into full consideration those who may be stigmatized and are marginalized, whether they be our patients or our family members that we work with, to make sure that they have the kind of voice and agency that is important for quality healthcare delivery. When we think about healthcare teams, for example, if they wanted to institute a behavioral contract for a difficult family who is seen as being verbally abusive towards staff, say, engaging in an ethics of syncopation might mean guiding the team to transform this process into a bi-directional exchange of expectations and needs where the parents, if you're dealing with kids or other family members, have the opportunity to express their expectation of team members. This becomes really interesting and important, I think, for this idea of syncopation. Things that have always been there, but perhaps haven't fully been heard. Listening to marginalized patients and family members is extremely important, and uplifting and listening to those voices of healthcare team members with less professional authority and institutional power is also extremely important. We all know, or perhaps have participated, or many of us have participated in those cases where a patient's family member or even a patient felt unheard and perhaps didn't trust the medical team and perhaps resisting recommendations. And oftentimes in situations like this, the turning point of the case is recognizing that, say, a speech therapist who has a wonderful relationship with one of the members of the family or the patient himself, and had been involved with their care over many different occurrences. But yet these individuals are left out of the deliberation. And oftentimes when there's a correction and an inclusion of these folks who are able to help facilitate conversation, begins to carve out a pathway forward to resolving some of the issues that people may be experiencing as they're wrestling with questions of medical decision-making in the ethical consult process. And so it's important for those who are nurses, nursing aides, chaplains, and music therapists, and others who may not always be able to express their agency fully, given the way some of our institutions may be shaped, to listen, to pay attention to those voices there that can help us have a rhythm that provides quality health care to patients and their families. Moreover, I want to argue that healthcare providers, ethicists, sociologists, chaplains, and others working in various spaces arrive at a sense of respect for patients and move towards quality healthcare when they can take seriously the experiences and the voices of those most marginalized in our spaces, and also by structural inequalities. The application of syncopation extends beyond interpersonal encounters to how the history of work in medical ethics, and more broadly bioethics, is often told. How do we tell these stories? In our recounting the history of medical ethics, we need to have the ability to identify those people, movements, and issues that have not always been part of the telling of the story. Such an undertaking has been done by medical historian Robert Baker in his recent book, Making Modern Medical Ethics. Now, that's just the first part of the title. Now, Ryan may appreciate this, and other philosophers in the space, right? There was a time in kind of modern philosophy when the titles of essays were like literally the first sentence of the paper, and then they shorten it to a title. But it's like, if you look at the real title, it's like a full sentence long. And so Robert Baker's book is titled Making Modern Medical Ethics, How African Americans, Anti-Nazis, Bureaucrats, Feminist Veterans, and Whistleblowing Moralists Created Bioethics, right? And it actually fit all on the front cover, right? I told him that when he was at Duke not so long ago. Now, Dr. Baker does give a counter-narrative based on firsthand historical research that he was involved in of primary documents and careful analysis of socio-historical context of what some have considered the birth of bioethics. The traditional account underscores how the rise of medical technologies towards the end of the 20th century, such as the dialysis machine and ventilators, created the need to reassess common approaches to medical ethics in use at this particular time. In Baker's work, he foregrounds often overlooked stories and actions of those people who and movements that confronted unethical treatment of people in medicine. So here again, syncopation is being aware of the main beats and the offbeats. We accent that which was always there, but perhaps has not fully been heard. The second motif from jazz that I would like to just highlight for our consideration is probably very familiar, improvisation. Improv, or infinite play, is the infinite possibility of creative solution and generosity of work, and what that has to say about the hope of and moving forward toward what we cannot yet see. Other forms of music may employ improvisation, but in jazz, many would suggest that it is often expected. Some would go so far to say if there is no improvisation, then there really is no jazz. And so to compose in the moment can be a risky enterprise, of course, and yet it seems to be, according to some, a necessary condition of this particular genre. Improvisation is that which allows jazz to exist in a continual state of renewal. And this becomes interesting, I think, and important for us to just think about for just a bit here. There is a kind of freshness to the music. Improvisation is often seen as this essential component. It is improvisation that makes the playing of the same old song, so to speak, seem like a new song every time it is performed, because it is a music of both traditions and of freedoms. The idea that jazz is a music of traditions and freedoms, I want to stress, is important for us, as one ethicist has pointed out here. He writes, improvisation is the willingness to live within the bounds of the past and yet to search for the future at the same time. Improvisation is the desire to make something new out of something old. It is the craving to respect tradition while at the same time leaving one's own mark. Improvisation is having a plan, yet not being incarcerated by the plan. It is experienced in being open to letting the people around you, whether they are in the band or spectators in the audience, to have input into and impact on what you are creating. You see, improvisation is about being so familiar with one's instrument of choice, say, or the song, and the essentials that we can trust ourselves for the unseen, for what the moment may be requiring or presenting upon us. And many would say, wow, you think about that, or trying to think about engaging in improvisation in the kind of work that we do. That's a kind of fearful enterprise. What if we fail or make mistakes? Well, the reality is that we're going to have those fears of failure, whether or not we think seriously about the notion of improvisation or not. But one of the beautiful things about this is that it recognizes that there are freedoms that we have to explore as we work within traditions. And as we do this in a communal context especially, there are always others that can pick us up. And so with this skill of improvisation, we practice it. We think about the practice of medicine, the practice in the work of bioethics. We become more skilled the more that we do it. And it's not so much in terms of the fear of failure. The issue is, how do we practice so that we can fail better? Right? Again, this may be, just maybe, a reflection from an imperfect art about how we navigate this space. We think about the training of healthcare providers that they receive and that trainees are receiving. These resources are of utmost importance. Medical professionals are intimately familiar, or ought to be, with the relevant biological sciences, important for their specialty. They are ingrained with the essential tools that can help diagnose and treat or engage in relevant kinds of medical research to address all sorts of health challenges. It is this deep familiarity with the relevant medical sciences and the cultivated judgments that have developed over time in seeing patients over a course of a career that allows for the kind of trust to search for creative ways when we encounter moments of uncertainty. It is a kind of creativity, some would suggest, again within the bounds of tradition. In terms of clinical encounters, the notion of improvisation can help healthcare providers learn and grow with each clinical encounter, because in jazz, if it is really jazz marked by improvisation, you never play the same song twice. And if this is so, then every patient encounter is a different encounter, even if the patients are presenting with familiar diagnoses, say. The theme of improvisation reminds us of creative possibilities with the patient by listening to the unique perspective and experience of that person in that particular moment in time. Being aware of the nature of improvisation reminds us to be present fully in the moment. It reminds us to be attentive to the needs of one another in the moment. So there's a familiarity. People know, oftentimes, medical professionals, what someone may be dealing with or the burdens they may be carrying biologically by listening to symptoms or even looking at certain physical aspects of their physical condition. And yet, as familiar as that same old song may be, it's a new song because it's a different person with a different history who's on a different journey that many of you who are healthcare professionals have the privilege to be on with these individuals here. The same can be said of those doing work in bioethics, broadly speaking, even at the research level, or some would say academic bioethics. It is important to know the basic contours of the field, the key issues, the various methodologies and debates that have shaped the field and the inherited traditions, and yet each generation coming in the field needs to create new pathways forward for changing times while building off or maybe even deviating from that which has come before. Even in those times when it is felt that a move in a radically different direction is needed, one still needs to be acquainted with that which has come before. It is important to generate new ideas for emerging medical, technological, and social challenges that are facing modern healthcare. And all of this, again, is important for us to keep in mind. We enjoy the art of improvisation when we see it, whether in music or comedy or wherever it emerges, because we take enormous satisfaction in seeing what a great mind can create spontaneously. We're interested in what artists can do given the constraints of their art. The third motif from jazz that I want to highlight for our consideration is this notion of, some would call it economy of play or call and response. Economy of play or call and response is a deep sense of a kind of give and take. It is a mutuality that is playful often and not very begrudging. It is neither procedural nor merely, okay, I guess it's your turn to play, I guess. This notion is deeply relational, and it reflects a communal way of life where everyone is involved. Many of my mentors, when I was studying ethics or got into bioethics primarily, really emphasized the communal nature of the work of ethics. They would often chastise some of us who are trained in moral philosophy that you are trying to do armchair philosophy, sitting kind of by yourself thinking these grand thoughts, when actually the work of ethics is a team sport if we think about it in a practical way of engaging in the space. And this notion of jazz reminds us of this deep communal nature where so many other people are involved in the moment of creativity and what it means to really navigate the space. There's not merely a performer on stage, spectators in the audience, and maybe sound engineers controlling technical components. Musicians are often calling out to each other, and then they respond. The group calls out to the audience, and they are conditioned to respond. The audience then calls back out to the musicians, and the musicians often respond. And it is a series of moments of mutuality and deep relationality. It requires an economy of generosity marked by community. It requires the ability and the kind of formation that we need to call people in instead of calling people out. You see, when I think about these artists and watch them perform or even talk to them, excuse me, they talk about the importance of what it means to kind of take turns here, where others have a chance to carry the rhythm while one musician perhaps solos. These other band members provide the grounding, the base, the framework that the improviser creates within. Again, how do we do this together? And even as the improviser is doing his work, right? In the moment of creativity, even if it's not quite what they want, there are others who are there to pick it up. At the same time, these band members must also follow the improviser and be ready to crescendo and decrescendo, to modulate and to change tempos as the music evolves. None of us can do this kind of work alone. We carry each other at different times and in many different ways. And so this requires genuine care and commitment to one another, as well as a kind of humility and vulnerability. And we know that in the work of clinical ethics and health justice, that these are the kinds of characteristics that are needed, again, to do this work well. So how does this musical art, jazz, understood as more than music, generate radical giving within the community? I think being aware of the notion of what some would call polyphony is important here. Polyphony is the style of simultaneously combining several parts, each forming an individual melody and harmonizing with each other. This notion highlights the importance of multiple voices and multiple melodies. And I think, again, this is an important ethical metaphor for the kind of work that many of us in this room here are either involved in or supporting in some way or another. Attention to call and response and polyphony helps not only cultivate the skill of being fully present to one another, but also more fully responsive to marginalized communities when providing health care when these groups are interacting with the healthcare system. It helps providers to step back and from the immediate dialogue and events in order to be cognizant of the larger picture. And part of being responsible requires self-reflection, both on how one may be perceived in a context and on the actual effects of one's actions and decisions. Each of these three themes, syncopation, improvisation, and call and response, requires a kind of deep listening. Now, following thinkers like Alistair McTire, I do understand a moral practice as an activity in which people work together using specific skills and methods toward a shared goal. Further, the goals, including the habits and disposition traits necessary for achieving those goals, themselves are often considered good for the professional practice and for the society at large. Now, as I often have to say, before all the ethicists in the room object or become too indignant with the reference to a broad notion of the good, I will, in exasperation with you, say and acknowledge that, yes, it is often easier said than it is determined. I am with you 100% on that. Nevertheless, I take it that the work of medicine and bioethics is a moral practice with goals, maybe not always well-defined, with some internal values to itself. And the values of medicine interact and intersect with broader sets of social values that can support or be in tension with it in various encounters. Now, I do want to skip ahead here to another slide here. So if we can go, one more above. Yeah, very good here. What those other slides kind of represent is just one of the challenges that I think we are facing are these healthcare disparities along racial and socioeconomic lines. And there's no need in a space like this to rehearse that data and that evidence because more than likely you're going to be very familiar and aware of all of that. And so the point that I wanted to even make by just highlighting that slide or just that particular problem is just the need for kind of rethinking notions of solidarity. And I actually want to suggest that taking seriously these motifs, these reflections from an imperfect art, understanding jazz is more than music, can help us think about the kind of solidarity and perhaps even form the kind of solidarities that's needed to address many of the problems that we are encountering, not only in our local settings, our institutions, our communities, but perhaps even in the broader world in which we find ourselves. And so I want to bring some of this together with this notion of either swing, some would say, or as some musicians would use the phrase, being in the pocket, or finding the groove. I want to suggest that paying attention to jazz as more than music can help us embrace this recommitment to the kind of solidarity that can help us move towards justice in health and in healthcare. This is a recommitment, a reaffirmation of a kind of solidarity that is a unity among people within a social organization. It is to have a firm commitment to the common good of all people, with special attention to those who may be on the margins. Now, I argue that we understand the common good as a good for all, not a good for each member of a given society. So in this sense, it is not to be understood as the greatest good for the greatest number of people. The common good language that I want to employ here reflects a broader characteristic of our social world. It points to the material, real-world conditions in which people live and how we arrange our social lives that impact how we do life together and the ways that we bump into each other. Social arrangements, so shaped by policies, laws, and practices, matter with respect to promoting or stifling human flourishing. The common good reflects the degrees to which the social conditions enable members of a given society to flourish. So working for the common good means deeply and creatively and generously working with community partners to promote health and health justice. It means working against poverty. It means working against racism, sexism, and any other forms of social marginalization that stifle human well-being. Further, commitments to the common good require that we continue to expand our moral universe into the realm of environmental concerns and issues of ecological justice. A commitment to solidarity, then, is a realization that all inhabitants of this great world house are now and will continue to be neighbors, brought into being largely because of the modern scientific and technological revolutions. Thus, people, we have obligations to work on behalf of one another. Solidarity requires a deep and radical commitment to those who may be part of, as Howard Thurman often said, the diminished, the disinherited, and the disenfranchised are those whose backs are already against the wall. A commitment to solidarity requires both individual and communal introspection and action. Individually, solidarity also invites us to consider whether our own behaviors and mentalities demonstrate a concern with those on society's margins. Communally, solidarity challenges us to ask whether the social organizations of which we are a part strengthen the bonds of human friendship, especially the bonds between those with and those without sufficient resources. So maybe these reflections from an imperfect art, all that jazz we may say, can be of help with guiding these processes in navigating uncertain terrains. Considering the systemic nature of the problems that we often encounter in our work, ways forward will require both individual and communal responses within healthcare and outside of it to reassess our broader societal values. Maybe attention to syncopation and call and response can help us find pathways towards health justice. Maybe, just maybe, syncopation can help us see the unseen and hear the unheard by paying attention to those on the margins. Maybe, just maybe, attention to syncopation, attention to improv can shape our hearts and our minds to understand the past in ways so that we're able to invent a new future together. And maybe, just maybe, this notion of call and response can inspire us to embed ourselves in a kind of relationality that can lift all of us. And so perhaps these reflections from an imperfect art will give us something to start a conversation and discussion. And I look forward to a call and response with the rest of you as we riff off of some of these ideas and together. Thank you so much for your time, attention, and patience.
Thank you very much for the talk. Thank you very much for the ideas. That was a lovely evening and a lovely discussion. Not a discussion, we didn't discuss. Lovely lecture. One of the questions that came to mind for me is you're mentioning on each patient is different and how we can take our skills but yet still reflect on the individual nature of each patient. What are some things that you think health professionals, so having done many ethics consults in my career and training, one of the concerns is I don't want to mess up. I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to say the wrong thing. What could health professionals take from jazz and the improvisation of sometimes a mistake can just lead to a new trail?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And yeah, and also, you know, Ryan, given just your deep experience here, I would love for others to hear you on this also. And, you know, it's interesting because oftentimes we think about, you know, jazz or this kind of imperfect art, and people are making mistakes and trying things in the moment, and if something doesn't work, it's not as if a trap door opens up and you just fall down and like that's it, right? You have an opportunity to articulate something again or say, wait, that didn't quite come out right. Let me start over, right? And that's actually okay, right? Because again, we don't have to be perfect all the time, and oftentimes encounters with people, I think we appreciate, yes, we want competence, right? You know, and make sure that people know what they're doing, and also we recognize that we don't always get it right. And so I think this notion of jazz just kind of reminds us that, you know, there's something that is beautiful that can come from mistakes. There's one example, I remember reading it somewhere, I can't remember exactly where it was now, I know it's gonna frustrate me forever, but they were talking about a performance that Wynton Marsalis was giving, and of course, like in any performance, well, they were, I think, I'm not sure if they were recording it that night or they were just getting a general recording. But anyway, they just wanted to create a great experience for those who were in attendance. And so they asked you to, you know, turn your phones off, you know, to not disrupt the performance. And so Marsalis gets into this intense kind of solo, and he's engaging and everybody's enthralled. And then all of a sudden somebody's cell phone goes off in the middle of this, right? And it had this like ringtone to it, right? So it was like whatever, right? And so the person who was writing about this, he said, oh, he was so aggravated and frustrated. How could this person do such a thing? The brilliance of the moment has been ruined. And then all of a sudden, after the ringtone stopped, Wynton Marsalis actually played the exact same ringtone that he heard in his trumpet in the moment, and then continued on with his solo. And then the person who was writing about this experience was just like, oh my gosh, the brilliance of this, right, you know? And it's just, and it is interesting, right? Because sometimes what we take to be mistakes or something that misfires or something that we maybe didn't want to happen can still turn out in a way of dealing with people that can still be beneficial. And the last thing I'll say about this is that, you know, I do some work in theological ethics, as you mentioned in your, you know, in your introduction. And there's this Greek term, and it comes up in Greek philosophy in general. It also shows up oftentimes in some forms of religious ethics. The Greek term is prosopon. And the etymological sense of the word, it basically just means to turn to the face of the other. And often the word prosopon is translated person. And what's interesting about that is that when that term shows up, when it talks about person, there's a deep relationality, a communal aspect. So it's not just thinking about persons in a kind of self-conscious, self-reflected, disembodied, kind of autonomous, you know, kind of entity, right? Because I've never seen a disembodied reasonable person anyway when we think about these disembodied reasonable person standards, but I'm sorry, I digress, right? That's my little pet peeve. So you all can beat me up later on that. As my mom says, son, you're a big boy, you just got to take those blows, right? Or as the young people say, take that L as part of the game, right? I say, oh, that's kind of clever, I like that. But at any rate, so this notion of the prosopon persons, right? Just turning to the face of the other. And I think that when we're present and when we listen well and we engage and we turn to the face of the other, there's a sense in which, yeah, we make mistakes, but that attention to the interpersonal dynamic recognizes the kind of fallibility that comes with those encounters. And at the end of the day, it's okay.
That actually leads into kind of my next question. When I teach ethics consultation, one of the most important aspects I teach about having a conversation is the listening.
Yeah.
Listening to the patients, giving them questions that open up the space. And you mentioned that, creating the space for conversations.
Yeah.
how can we teach healthcare providers to listen better to the conversation, where they're more focused on where they want that conversation to go, rather than listening and allowing the natural conversation to happen?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's yeah, in terms of how do we teach that, right? It's tough, right? Because I think many of us, as we enter into new space, we're learning a craft, we're taking it, seriously, as we should, and with whatever it is that we're doing. And we also recognize that some of this work, a lot of it can be high stakes, right? And so there's a sense in which we want to be extremely prepared and kind of know where things are going and have everything laid out. And oftentimes what happens is that, as you've just articulated, right, just that we're so focused on kind of getting through whatever the mental script is in our head that we fail to actually be attentive to the moment and being able to shift and change. And I think a lot of this, obviously that some of us have dealt with and maybe still deal with, and no matter how long we've been doing this, imposter syndromes, right? Do we really belong? Are they going to really find out that I really don't know what I'm doing here, right? Or I feel like I don't know what I'm doing here. I had some things that work out, but man, I don't feel comfortable all the time. And so I have to, kind of put on airs. And sometimes these kind of things weigh on us. And so this is where I think, again, if we think about jazz understood as more than music, as these motifs, as we habitually just kind of like reflect on these ideas and put some of these things into practice, there's a sense, and even the way we perform, to just recognize that it's okay to be in the moment, because this notion of traditions and freedoms, right? So often I think medical professionals, because medical professionals, right, are often trained to be very technical, very specific. So that's the traditions, kind of aspect of the metaphor, right? It's there, it's sturdy, it's stable. The squishy stuff, right? The freedoms, right? Well, what is that part all about? But the reality is that that's where many healthcare professionals live anyway, right? That we're already doing these kinds of things. And so I think just the idea of resting in the fact that you're skilled in the tradition of medicine, if you did your training, well, and then you continue to put in practice and trust yourself, right? That you can listen to people and respond accordingly without doing kind of intense damage in some ways. And the last thing I'll say about this particular point, and if you have some good feedback too, I would just want to invite you to share it as well. But this is why we talk about the communal and the relational piece here, and we talk about the practice of medicine. And when musicians talk about practicing their craft, it's exactly that. We have to practice this, right? To develop the kinds of dispositions. So we start in the habits. So we do this relationally and communally. We learn from others. We watch others. Musicians often talk about that there are certain folks or certain sounds that they hear when they first start of other voices. And a lot of their early work kind of similar to these other voices, because those are the voices they're listening to that inspires them in some ways. And that kind of carries them as they're practicing, but the more they do it, at some point they find their own voice. And often these seasoned folks will tell you it's okay to like find voices that you kind of mimic a little bit, that you kind of learn from, but at some point you have to continue to find your own voice. And so I guess that would be a very loose way, not in a formulaic way, which I know sometimes we like the kind of, give me a framework, right? Kind of algorithm.
Hartnett would be very disappointed in
Yeah,
that.
right. You'll be disappointed, right, in that. But I think really the kinds of things I'm talking about are habits and forming dispositions. And that has to come from bumping into each other and watching and listening and learning from those who've done it before and putting it into practice.
That's just one point before we open up to the audience that I really appreciate from your talk, was talking about the history and the culture and how jazz couldn't have come out of a vacuum, that it comes from the history of the people who had it. So when we make medical recommendations or we do ethics consults and we're thinking this patient's not thinking rationally, or how are they coming to this decision, we can't just take that in the vacuum of the moment. We have to understand the culture, the history, who that patient is, on how did they arrive to that recommendation, or how did they arrive to that decision for themselves, rather than a purely rational if P then Q kind of decision.
Yeah, right. I mean, and the way we emote to states of affairs, and I one that would say that I think our emotions can have cognitive content, and while that may not be the end stop, right, but it certainly has to be part of our humanity and how we interact with each other. Now, before we turn to questions here, because I really want to get there, but I do want to ask you a question, right? Because I heard something a little bit earlier. I'm putting you on the spot. See, just improvise, right? That's all you got to do is improvise.
I asked you about getting comfortable improvising.
Right. So look, I mean, I heard that when you are thinking about clinical ethics work and in clinical ethics consults, you listen to jazz, right? Is that right?
Yes.
And why is that?
I had read, being a father and reading about listening to classical music and raising the IQ of your son, I read about that if you listen to classical music, it kind of elevates your brain because it's trying to match the complication that it's hearing. So I always listen to jazz whenever I'm thinking of a consult, if I'm reading a chart or thinking through it, because I want to think creatively. I want to think differently. I think that there's a structure and that most people are thinking within that structure. How do I think outside of that structure? How do I approach this from a different angle? So I'll listen to all of my favorite musicians. My wife, she'll forgive me. I try to not play the Charlie Parker as loud as I can, and maybe do a little bit more like Bill Evans to calm it down. But I try to think from a different way, still within the structure of what we can do for these patients, but what is something that maybe we're not seeing? So I try to be inspired by some of the greats before of creating, reflecting differently.
Wow, very good. Thank you. That's great.
I'm Carry-On Parsi. I'm the John B. Francis Co-Chair in Bioethics with Nanette Elster. Delighted to be here, Patrick. Brilliant presentation. This is the second time I heard this presentation. This is even better than the first time I heard it. But I think you're drawing on some really important themes. I love these motifs of syncopation and call and response and improvisation. And I wanted to ask you about bioethics as a social movement, because you mentioned Bob Baker. Bob Baker talks about bioethics as being, in many ways, like a patient's rights movement in response to traditional medical paternalism. And I'm curious how you square these different motifs with these more recent movements of like the patient safety movement, the quality improvement movement, where we're really trying to make more uniform and consistent healthcare. Like we're kind of obsessed with metrics and measuring and making sure that quality is consistent. So how do you square away these motifs, which I think are incredibly important, improvisation and syncope, with this obsession of consistent quality healthcare everywhere, anywhere?
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Parsi, for that question. And yeah, I mean, and just because I noticed our time is getting a little shorter, and so I'll try to go straight to what I really think about this, is that I think all of those things are important, right? And the points that I was emphasizing here are just the kinds of dispositions that we need. And so I tried to emphasize, especially when we got to the notion of improvisation, this notion of traditions and freedoms, right? And so I think it's the traditions piece, right? That there are these values that are there, there are goals and objectives and purposes for the practice of healthcare, what can count as quality healthcare, right? Medicine as a moral practice. One of the reasons why you kind of invoked McIntyre, and even though I don't, agree with McIntyre on all of his, kind of moral philosophy or ethical theory, it's just this idea of that that something has, it's a kind of moral practice engagement that has certain ends and goals, right, that need to be objective. So I would suggest that for the kinds of concerns that you're raising, which are proper to raise, fall within the traditions piece, right? And we're always thinking creatively, even how to improve those measures, right? So you can still have the kind of subjective aspect interacting with what some would consider the more objective aspects that provide quality care. And I think those have to work together, as is always the case, apart from whether or not we took jazz into consideration, right? We're always toggling between these, kind of objective measures and the kinds of judgments that we make about whether we've met those measures and even evaluating the measures themselves, right? And so I think that the jazz motifs can kind of map onto that work and just name what it is that we're doing intuitively. Yeah. At least that's all I got there, Kehan. So, right.
Thoroughly enjoyed and was enlightened by your presentation. My name is Cuthbert Simpkins. I'm an endowed chair at the UMKC School of Medicine doing research. I'm also the author of a book on John Coltrane.
Oh, wow.
And they actually, Duke archived the tapes that I used, of the various musicians that I acquired through doing the book. And I want to confirm from the experiences that I had talking to Coltrane's wife,
Yeah.
she would tell me how Coltrane and Eric Dolphy would practice, but not to perfection. They would not practice until it was actually, there had to be some imperfection.
Yeah.
And you know, Miles would say, there are no mistakes.
Yeah.
There are no bad notes.
Yeah.
But my question to you is this. You know jazz is a revolutionary music, okay? And we talk about structure.
Yeah.
It may lead someone to difficulty because of the integrity involved. If you listen to jazz and you follow it, you may become an Ornette Coleman.
Yeah. I was just about to say that when you talked about your wife and Coltrane. Yes.
You know, and you might just turn the whole thing upside down.
Yep.
Or Sun Ra.
Yep.
And so what do you do about that?
Yes. Great. Thank you, Dr. Simpkins. And I don't know if you have a copy of your book with you here, but I have cash and willing to pay, right? So, no, and I love Coltrane, huge Coltrane fan. I kind of cut my teeth early on as a teenager listening to some Coltrane. But yeah, it was interesting when, yes, I absolutely think about, jazz is revolutionary music. And this is where, one of the things I was trying to say earlier about even as we are wrestling with toggling between traditions and freedoms, right? And so, and actually what I have in mind is this kind of Latin sense of tradition, traduco, right? That which is carried over. And it's interesting because that word traduco can also have this sense of to betray, right, as well. And so this tradition, that which is carried over. And one of the things I'll try to emphasize is that even if we go significantly beyond, right, those structures, or even leave them altogether, I would suggest that there's still kind of an importance of knowing what it is that we are, kind of either overthrowing or having to revolutionize, or where we need to be radical in the etymological sense of going back to the roots of, certain kinds of things. And so I would hope that all that what I would say would be consistent with understanding jazz as a revolutionary music, right? And so this is the interesting thing about like Ornette Coleman, so with the avant-garde, kind of movement. I remember buying some albums of Ornette Coleman and not knowing exactly what I was getting into, listening to it, thinking like, oh my goodness, what is this, right? And I remember struggling through it and talking to a friend of mine, and I was like, I just don't get it. And so he had to explain to me, right, what was going on there with this avant-garde movement and just, and why people were exploring what they were exploring. And so this is where the education piece becomes so important, because then I had a deeper appreciation for what it is that Coleman and others in that movement were up to, even if it didn't, like resonate with me, right? So I can hear it and listen to it, even if I don't listen to it like all the time or that often, I can appreciate at least what some of these artists are up to. And I think that's really, really important. And I didn't bring it up here, but this notion of dissonance becomes another kind of motif or theme in jazz that I think is really important, that sometimes we just have to sit with dissonance. And some of this music, these kinds of issues are not always resolved. And I think about John Coltrane's Birdland, right? I think it's 5 tracks or something on there. And like the third or fourth one, Alabama, where he's talking about, the music is reflecting on the 4 young girls who were killed in the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church there in Birmingham, Alabama. And at the end, so in other words, the other tracks, right, are kind of, bebop and just kind of moving on, kind of quick pace, right? And then you get to Alabama. And it's just a different kind of sound, this ballad. And at the end, there's this wheel, this squawk that Coltrane plays on the horn. He stretches it out, and it just stops, right? Next track, right? And it's interesting because it's like it's jarring if you hear it for the first time, and there's something about the kind of evil that represented that we just have to sit with, that we can't easily move past. And yes, it's uncomfortable, it creates discomfort, and it ought to, and we gotta just sit with that for a while. And then it moves on to the next thing. And this is where we were talking earlier, how albums would oftentimes tell stories, right? Listening from like the first track all the way to the end. So I'm sorry, that was a long-winded way. I'm so sorry. I know you guys got to get out of here, but thank you so much for that question. And I do think that is absolutely right. I would love to riff a little bit more with you on those issues. And I want to say just very, very quickly, because I know this is probably a closing announcement, but I want to encourage you. I grew up in the South, Alabama, and there was this guy who was building a storage shed in our backyard, and I just always was trying to help him. And so I was thinking I could, bring the 2x4s and hold some nails, and, Mr. T was his name, and he would go up on the, ladder, and he would do some work. He had a guy working with him, he took a break, and he was sitting under this large pecan tree that we had in our backyard. And so Mr. T said, Patrick, I want you to go over there. Well, he said, son, go over there and tell the guy to come back to finish the job before he gets shade poisoning. So I was like, okay. So I go over there, tell the guy who was sitting in the chair, I said, hey, Mr. T wants you to come back, finish this job before you get shade poisoning. So he grabs his stuff and goes back out. But I was like really concerned, like, wait a minute, I spent a lot of time under this pecan tree. And I'm like, do I have shade poisoning? And if I have it, how do I get rid of it, right? So I ran in the house, asked my mom, I said, Mom, Mr. T wanted this guy to come back out and finish working before he gets shade poisoning. I said, Mom, what is shade poisoning? She smiled and she says, well, you should probably go out there and ask Mr. T that. So I go back out and Mr. T was up on the ladder. I said, and I just stood there. And then he said, son, what is it? I said, Mr. T, what's shade poisoning? And so he comes down off the ladder and he puts his hand on my shoulder. He says, oh boy, shade poison ain't nothing but laziness. He said, but don't you worry about that. We have work to do. And so my last parting words to us is this. Let us resist the temptation in this good work of being lazy, because we have plenty of work to do and we can do it together. So thank you so very much for this evening. Yeah, okay, yeah, I just think I left that one.